My background is really not in almost anything that's being talked about here throughout the conference. My background really is mostly in religion and philosophy, dealing with manuscript evidence and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, when dealing with manuscript evidence, it's a very meticulous science, I think, and trying to find lines of consistency through different manuscripts is very important when you're dealing with religious and philosophical texts. And I try to do the same thing when I look at testimony that eyewitnesses and sometimes ear witnesses gave during deposition, or whether it be in cross-examination, or whatever the case may be. There's been a lot of mention early on today about probability. I'm not going to have any PowerPoint. I'm not going to do differential calculus up here, because God knows I couldn't do it if I wanted to. But some of the things that I teach in a philosophy class certainly would be chided, scolded for such silly, sophomoric, bordering on asymptotical assumptions. The notion that, the 3 days, you'd have to plan for a conspiracy the 1 day, as if people involved in conspiracy put it out on the hotline for everyone to verify ahead of time. I mean, that seems to me to be a little silly. The whole Ruby thing, 11/17, 11/21, it could very well be they just waited for Ruby to get set. That's certainly a possibility. But I think the worst one is when I heard, and I quote, the notion that the probability of unpopular conspiracies, and I immediately thought to myself, well, does that mean there's a high probability if it's popular conspiracy? I mean, where does this type of logic lead us? Well, that being said, there's been all types of quotes from Voltaire and Isaiah the prophet and the book of Job, but I'd like to quote Winnie the Pooh, if that's okay, this morning. Obviously, one of my favorite quotes is when he simply said, think, think, think. And that's what I want you to do this morning. As we go through this evidence, just think a little bit. Famous philosopher by the name of Leibniz said that it's not good enough just to ask questions. You must ask the right questions. Because if you ask the wrong questions, the conclusion that you are going to arrive at is not going to be the correct one. Walter Cronkite said, and it was quoted, I believe, last night, that we must have faith in the Warren Report. Well, let's take the biblical definition of faith and see how that squares. The biblical definition of faith goes as follows. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for." Well, that to me applies to the Warren, but not much substance. And the evidence of things not seen. And frankly, we haven't seen very much at all. So I guess taking that definition by Walter Cronkite, I guess I do have faith in the Warren Report. I think the problem with the critical research community in a lot of ways is that we, in a way, have been our own worst enemies and constantly shooting ourselves in the foot or in the feet with the most weird theories that can possibly be imagined. It's not odd that sometimes we would be considered a confederacy of dunces sometimes. And to me, the big one now and the latest cause célèbre is the whole notion behind the Zapruder film that it's been forged. And one of the proponents of that has actually suggested, well, in 1964, look at all the high-tech stuff they did with the movie Mary Poppins. Well, to compare the Zapruder film to Mary Poppins, I guess it would take a spoonful of sugar to swallow that one. That whole notion to me is just absolutely insane. I mean, everything, by the end of the day, everything is faked. And if everything has been faked and everything has been forged, where does that leave us when we look at the evidence, for goodness sakes? So what I would like to do is take a brief moment this morning, take a look at some of the witnesses that gave public testimony for the HSCA. Now, I interviewed Professor Blakey for 2.5 hours about 4 years ago. And I must tell you that Professor Blakey is charming, he's articulate, he's bright, and he was very accommodating for the entire 2.5 hours. I asked him question after question, peppered him with question after question, because at the time I was finishing my master's thesis, which was on the 52 witnesses that appeared and gave public testimony before the HSCA. I asked him, since all your conclusions really, except for one minor thing, pretty much endorse the entire Warren Report, then why didn't you call their chief witness, Howard Brennan? If he was the chief eyewitness that identified Oswald, to me, it seems like an egregious mistake not to call Brennan before the HSCA. We kind of waffled a little bit and we got talking back and forth. I said, but the problem is that besides the fact that Brennan is a pathological liar and that his book was published posthumously, which may account for why he doesn't directly go to hell, but beyond that, The problem with, when you read the Warren report, it says that they showed Brennan the Zapruder film. Nothing could be further from the truth. They never showed Brennan the Zapruder film. Let me tell you what they showed Brennan. They showed him one frame from the Zapruder film, a negative, and asked him to identify himself in one frame, which is only an 1/18 of a second long, in the Zapruder film. You know, when Bellin was cross-examining Brennan, he noticed that Brennan's legs weren't visible facing toward Elm Street, which is where the reenactment has Brennan. The fact of the matter is, all one has to do is look at the Zapruder film, and he's actually facing, with his legs over the little wall there, facing Houston Street. No wonder Brennan didn't see anything, and no wonder the HSCA didn't call him, and no wonder that David Bellin, when he noticed that, quickly jeted out of that little cross-examination and immediately went to something else. I asked Professor Blakey, were there any people that he called that he wishes that he wouldn't have called? He immediately mentioned Jack White. He thought that whole thing was an embarrassment and really wishes that he wouldn't have called Jack White, but wishes he would have called Bill Newman. When I asked him about Louis Stephen Witt, Umbrella Man, and I said, you know, why didn't you do the one thing that you should have done? Which is, why didn't you get a picture of Louis Stephen Witt circa 1963, compare it with the photographs you had of Witt in 1963, and just make a casual comparison? Well, he kind of mumbled and got out of that a little bit, but still believes that, you know, Witt is the person in question. When you've got to read Witt's testimony or watch it. I have it on video and audio. It is a masterpiece to watch. This guy, when asked about umbrellas, just happened to have that same umbrella 15 years later, which I guess isn't too completely preposterous, but he says, frankly, I have umbrellas everywhere. They're in the garage or in the truck. My God, this guy was the Penguin, for goodness sakes. I had umbrellas all over the place. No wonder he's Umbrella Man. And you know, I didn't stay on that too long because, you know, Blakey's very slick. He's a very slick communicator. I know why he's so powerful and gets things done. I asked him about Admiral Berkeley, the only doctor present at Parkland and Bethesda. He thought that was a mistake. I had copies of the autopsy photographs with me. And I said, you know, it's interesting that almost every person from Parkland, medical attendant, nurse, doctor, said that there was this hole in the back of John Kennedy's head. I said, is it possible, Professor Blakely, that they were all wrong? What are the odds of that? And he looked at me, never blinked an eye, says, yeah, they're all wrong. Didn't even hesitate, and obviously didn't faze him at all. What's interesting is that I asked him about the 52 witnesses that were showcased, two of which, by the way, are here today, Dr. Wecht and Bob Groden. And I asked him, I said, what was your purpose behind it? He said, the purpose of having those 52 witnesses appear and give public testimony was to showcase our case and the evidence that we had. As I got ready to leave 2.5 hours later, I had a copy of Blakey's book. And I asked Professor Blakey if he would sign it for me. And he signed it, and I didn't even bother to open it, went home, and I opened it. And as I opened the book, I noticed that he spells his name wrong. And I thought, you know, I waited all this time to get a really cool autograph from Blakey, and the guy misspells his name. But, you know, I got to think about it. I said, well, he's been somewhat dyslexic with a lot of things, let alone his name. We talked a long time about the headshot in frame 313, and he came up with a whole thing that Dr. Robertson talked about the neuromuscular reaction. I said, but you should have known better than that, Professor Blakey. He said, what do you mean by that? I said, because you had evidence that when a shot strikes someone in the head, that it sends them backwards. He said, what are you talking about? I said, I'll tell you what I'm talking about, because you not only investigated the Kennedy assassination, you investigated the King assassination. And based on your theory, when King got shot in the head, it should have flown him over the balcony onto the floor. He looked at me, I'm perplexed, you know, again, weaseled his way out of it. But I must say, it was a very eventful 2.5 hours. It was very interesting. And I must say, he is still to this day rather accommodating if I call him up and want to annoy him and bug him again. Now, let's take a look at just a few. We obviously don't have time to go through all 52. Let's take a look at Ida Dox. Now, Ida Dox is a very interesting individual. I talked to Ida Dox twice on the phone, October 14th and October 28th. I believe it was either in 98 or 99. I don't recall exactly. And she lives in Bethesda, Maryland. Her name, by the way, is not Ida Dox. I'll tell you afterwards if you really want to know her real name. It is not Ida Dox. I requested every document from the National Archives that had her name or the other name on it, and they sent me a huge package of stuff, and I'm going through all this stuff.